So this is the last session for today. Session title is Radiological Protection and the Public. I am Nobuhiko Ban from Nuclear Regulation Authority Japan, and I'm also a member of ICRP Committee 4. The objective of this session is to discuss the significance and role of radiological protection in society, taking into account the perspective of beneficiaries. Beneficiaries of radiological protection are those who are exposed or who could be exposed, whatever the category of exposure. There are many different settings. To cover a wide range of topics, we have 6 distinguished speakers. And now I hand the microphone over to the co-chair, Bernard Rouguen.
So, hello everybody again. I hope that's all is okay for you for this last session. We have different speakers, and well, we are involved in different sectors, and it will be very interesting to have the different overview about this important question. And the first speaker is Peter Breyer, that I know quite well. Peter is head of environment and radiation safety for EDF new nuclear build in UK. He holds an academic position at the University of Surrey in nuclear safety and radioactive waste management, and is a past president of the United Kingdom Society for Radiological Protection. So today his presentation is on nuclear industry experiences in radiation exposure. So Peter, you have the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you to the ICRP for giving me the chance to talk today on behalf of the World Nuclear Association. For those of you that don't know about WNA, it's the international organization that represents the global nuclear industry. And that includes members of nuclear operator organizations, from mining and fuel fabrication companies, and also reactor vendors. And as such, the talk I'm about to give is of the views of the wider WNA. It's not just my own personal views. And importantly, that means if there are any difficult questions, I can delegate it to anyone from the nuclear industry. So, into the important talking points. So, the international nuclear industry has for many years had an impressive record of controlling and reducing worker and public exposures. And that's both from a collective and individual dose perspective. Now, as an example, you'll see on the screen, the figure shows the average annual collective dose per reactor per region of the world. And that's showing it in a time period from the 1980s to around about now. Now, what you'll see is, whilst there are some variations across individual parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, the industry has been able to demonstrate the central importance of exposure optimization, with current average worker doses being around 1 millisievert per year for the whole nuclear fuel cycle. Now, that is broadly within the variability of natural background, as you all know. In a similar vein, if we look at public doses, and we look at some of the doses that we predict for some of the new nuclear power stations in the UK, then the dose to the representative person is around about 2.7 microsieverts per year. So we're talking about very low exposures. So how have we got to this stage? What's led to this position here? Well, key to the success of these results has been the optimization, or as you've all known, the ALARA principle. Now, to achieve ALARA, there are 2 main priorities that need to be considered. Firstly, there's the development of structured approaches to reach ALARA, those framework, those tools you use to make your ALARA decisions. And that needs to emphasize the clear balance between the reduction of the magnitude of the exposure or dose against that of the cost of that reduction and the societal impact. And the really second important principle to get us to this point is the positive will to pursue ALARA, which for those of you that work in the industry and have had to deal with ALARA and dose and risk assessments, having that positive will can be difficult at times. but this is more commonly known as nuclear safety culture. Now, in terms of nuclear safety culture, since the late 1980s, there's been a large program of work by various international and national bodies looking at what do we mean by nuclear safety culture or radiation safety culture as a subset of that. And what they've all come up to is that to create this healthy safety culture within a nuclear operator requires a collective commitment of leaders, but also individuals within that organization, to emphasize safety over competing goals and to ensure protection of people and the environment is paramount. And this can be further broken down, and I've tried to summarize some of those key attributes on the slide here. Just to name a few, it talks about things like a systematic approach to safety, it talks about an absence of safety versus delivery conflict, it talks about the relationship with other parties, the regulators, the other stakeholders such as the public, the people you're living and working with, and also, really importantly, that questioning attitude you'll often hear mentioned. However, despite the success of where we are now, we have now seen that the reduction of exposures is leading us to a place where we might have a challenge, where ALARA might become minimization of exposures rather than optimization of radiation protection. So why is that? Well, given the low levels of exposures we're now talking about what 1 millisievert, as I said, over the average dose over the entire nuclear fuel cycle, 2.7 microsieverts to the public. Well, given we're dealing with these really low exposures now, and if you were to apply the ALARA principle in its purest sense, as those balance of those three items on the screen, then what can happen is you can get an outcome which is disproportionate in terms of wider non-radiological hazards, but also in terms of the use of resources, both physical resources, such as steel, such as concrete, such as water, and human resources as well. And in today's world, where there's increasing societal and environmental considerations, such as climate change, such as resource shortages, such as water, this is a real challenge to our profession in terms of maintaining the suitability of ALARA. So what can we do about that? Well, in recent years, and we've already heard about it mentioned in several places across this event already, there's been an increasing shift in industry to give consideration to all hazards within the ALARA process and not only radiation, and to focus not only on people, but also the environment. So what you now end up with is this new triangle. And the aim of this approach is to move to an outcome where it's not only the ALARA outcome, but it's also the right sustainable outcome. And that's important to remember that sustainability by its very definition is a balance of environment, social, and economics. And so a very simple tweak of including the word environment and considering the all hazards part of this means you can move to a sustainable outcome. However, that is not the only challenge to the ALARA principle. Experiences in new nuclear, across a various number of members within WNA, has shown that even where the levels of exposure are trivial, 1,000 times less than background radiation, the perceived risk of radiation, in particular in the context of nuclear power, can still result in outcomes where you need to implement further measures to reassure the public, to give confidence to other stakeholders. And that's at a cost which is disproportionate to the risk, and at times also the resource usage, which is disproportionate to the risk. And so we need to go one step further even than that. And as such, this is where we can further enhance the ALARA principle, as seen on the screen. Namely, where the public or other stakeholders involved in a radiation exposure are applicable, no matter how low or small that risk, there is a need to consider how can we use engagement as a mechanism to mitigate societal stress. And although this can be seen by some as an additional cost, spending that effort to communicate to people, to tell them why this isn't an issue, well, only by doing so can we truly reach a balanced treatment of risk, based on a common understanding between all stakeholders. So I just want to go on to touching, what have been the main feedback from the nuclear industry in terms of the challenges going forward? Well, I've just covered probably the one main talking point, which has been a focal theme for quite some time, and that is to move to an all-hazards, sustainable approach to the implementation of ALARA. Alongside that, there's a need to obviously continue and maintain a strong safety culture. And with the resurgence in new nuclear build, if we're talking about small modular reactors, that also means to evolve safety culture to look at the role within the supply chain as well, that play a very important part in manufacturing these power stations and other sources. We also need to look at tackling the increased shortage of radiation protection and wider resource within the nuclear industry. And to do that, we need to start exploring more opportunities for global harmonization of competency standards, allowing increased mobility of skilled workforces between borders. We need to look at an introduction of a graded approach, keeping the focus on the high doses and the risks. So, for example, some of the highest exposures you get in the nuclear industry are from those that work in outages, those workers that go from site to site to site to site, dealing with some of the high exposures. And by having a graded approach, it means we focus on those individuals rather than the more minimal administrative exposures we have within the stations themselves. We need to look at improving public understanding, and that's been another central theme in the conference already. And importantly, improving public understanding doesn't mean telling people what is safe. It means actually giving them information to make their own informed decisions on what is safe. Because as we've seen with the examples of the COVID pandemic, people make their own judgments. You can only give them the information to make those judgments. And lastly, we need to continually adapt our processes to take advantages of new technologies out there. We heard some great talks yesterday, for instance, about artificial intelligence and what role that can play in further optimization of various processes, such as waste management. And this is obviously just a short presentation and touch on some of the key considerations. We also have a poster outside from WNA, which I encourage you to take a look at as well, which goes into this in a bit more further detail. And I look forward to any questions later on after the other talks. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, summarizing future challenges very clearly. And the second speaker is Dr. Jin-Chul Pan. He is from Seoul National University Hospital, Korea. He is a medical doctor specialized in nuclear medicine. Today, he will share his experience in interacting with patients and their families. Presentation title is Communication with Patients on Radiological Procedures. Dr. Pan, floor is yours.
Thank you for kind introduction. I am Jin-Chul Pan from Seoul. As you may know, in the daily life radiation exposure, medical radiation is quite amount. In United States, about half of the usual daily life radiation is from medical procedures, including nuclear medicine. In Korea, in my country, the medical procedure is a little bit underused and the natural radiation is a little bit high. So about 25 to 30% of overall radiation is coming from medical procedures. As you know, medical radiation exposure is two parts. The diagnostic radiation is coming from a CT, like radiological imaging, and also nuclear medicine imaging, such as PET. Therapeutic radiation includes external beam radiation, particle therapy, neutron beam therapy, and also radiopharmaceutical therapy. Radiopharmaceutical therapy is a little bit different from others because it is not local but systemic. So the radiation is imposed on whole body. Recently, there is quite an expansion of therapeutic radiopharmaceuticals. You may know the radioiodine therapy for thyroid cancer or iodine MIBG therapy for pheochromocytoma. However, about 10 years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a big success of the Lutathera. It is targeted for neuroendocrine tumor. And there is a big investment of big pharmas. So this year, Novartis Pluvicto, which target for prostate cancer, is approved by FDA. Additionally, there is another investment. As you can see here, Novartis has a big pipeline list for radiopharmaceutical imaging and treatment. And also, another big pharma, Bayer, also has a pipeline for radiopharmaceutical imaging and therapy. They are particularly interested in alpha therapy. They already have a drug for prostate cancer, Xofigo, radium-223, and also they stated that they have targeted thorium conjugates. So, in radiological procedure, justification is important. In this therapeutic agent, there is a clear benefit exceeding risk. So, patients have good awareness on the need of the procedure. However, there are also some borderline justification. In case of some diagnostic procedures and some preventive therapeutic procedures, such as radioiodine ablation, then the benefit over risk is a little bit confusing. If you see this case, this is a 61-year-old male who has metastatic pheochromocytoma. He already underwent palliative radiation therapy and several cycles of iodine MIBG therapy. However, he had many metastatic regions in whole body, and he referred for lutetium dotatate therapy. In this case, the benefit is clear over the risk or cost. This is another case, 11-year-old girl. She has papillary thyroid cancer. Some of you may think that thyroid cancer is a good cancer. However, there is no good cancer. The patient has lung metastasis, and as you can see here, there are radioiodine ovid metastasis in the lungs. She underwent 3 cycles of radioiodine therapy, and the structural regions have disappeared. In this case, also, the benefit exceeds cost, definitely. When communicating with these patients, we can show some kinds of information like this. The prognosis of your cancer, metastatic pheochromocytoma, metastatic thyroid cancer, it is not good. You may get benefit from these drugs. However, as I told you, there are some equivocal cases. How about this case? 5-year-old man, 5-year-old boy who has moderate head trauma. 11-year-old boy with thyroid cancer, which is intermediate risk. How about 50-year-old man who is asymptomatic and wants to get some cancer screening test? 71-year-old man who has frequent forgetfulness and who wants to screening for Alzheimer's dementia. In this case, radiological studies, imaging and therapy are justified. There are some data on the risk. You can see some reports, some studies reported the risk, cancer risk from CT or X-ray, which have been published in high-impact journals. However, most of these studies are based on assumption and simulation. Actually, this is not real-world data. Regarding radioiodine therapy, there are some real-world data. In case of radioiodine therapy, the radiation dose is estimated about 1 sievert per 150 millicurie based on current dosimetry scheme. It is not small dose. It is a considerable dose. So there are many reports about the effect of this radioiodine therapy. However, still, the conclusion is confusing and unclear. According to a recent systematic review article, they concluded that quality of evidence was very low. So, an excess risk for the development of secondary primary malignancy cannot be excluded, but is expected to be small. So, in benefit cost evaluation, we refer to this result. This is another case. This is 11-year-old boy with papillary thyroid cancer. He has intermediate risk thyroid cancer. The patient's mother questions, should he undergo radioiodine therapy for ablation? Ablation means a kind of a preventive therapy, not therapeutic one. Is there any way to avoid radioiodine therapy? To answer this question, American Thyroid Association provides guidelines. In case of intermediate high risk, diagnostic whole body scan need to be performed first. According to the findings, the next step, iodine-131 therapy, is determined. In this patient, iodine-131 scan, iodine-123 scan is performed, and you can see there is minimal remnant thyroid and no metastatic regions. In this case, additional radioiodine ablation can be avoided. So, when we communicate with the patient or patient caregiver, these points need to be informed. First benefit, we need to inform the patient what is the patient condition, what is the risk of the disease, current status, and what is the expected effect of the treatment or imaging. And also some cost or risk, putative radiation hazard, although according to the evidences, there is a low and unclear effect. Additionally, I usually stress this point. Patient option or action is also important. I recommend the patient, you can avoid radioiodine therapy. Then you can choose active surveillance. Then it depends on your decision. And also, there's some way how to reduce our radiation dose with radioactive iodine treatment. If we use recombinant human TSH to stimulate the thyroid, instead of thyroid hormone withdrawal, we can reduce a little bit radiation dose. And also, active hydration, where salivary gland activation is important. And also, there are some ways to improve efficacy of radioactive iodine treatment. If patients do low iodine diet well, the overall dose can be reduced because we can omit next round of treatment. There is another point regarding the communication. As I showed you in previous slide, there are some screening tests for disease. For example, cancer screening using CT or PET-CT in asymptomatic patients. And recently, there are some brain imaging for Alzheimer's disease using PET scan. In this case, the benefit is borderline. However, the cost, the risk is low dose radiation. In this case, appropriate use criteria are required to give the patient a relatively accurate information. So in summary, in communication with the patient, science-based quantitative benefit is very important. We need to give information on purpose and role of the procedure, and condition of the patient and disease, and need of the procedure. And we may show them that this kind of survival data. And also, science-based quantitative risk is important. For this, we need communicable radiation dose estimation. However, more important one is the meaning of the amount. As you can see, this is the old Zimbabwe dollar. You know that it is $100 trillion, but it is only 40 cents. So in this case, we can give them some numbers. However, we need to also inform that the meaning of the numbers. And finally, the important thing is the options for self-decision and self-control. We can give them alternative way or options. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing the first-hand experience. I forgot to say in the introduction, Dr. Pan is also a member of ICRP Committee too.
Thank you. And now it's time for the third speaker, Jim Andros. Jim is qualified in physics and risk management. He has almost 40 years in radiation protection and occupational health and environmental protection in the mining industry. Currently, he's co-chair of the ICRP task group on norm in industry, and his presentation is on radiological protection and the public, norm and communicating the risk.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you, Bernard, for the introduction. I'm presenting to you today on behalf of the ICRP task group on norm in industry, of which Rainer Gellermann from Germany and I are co-chairs. The task group wishes to thank the organisers for the opportunity to give this presentation. For this presentation, we wanted to go beyond the straightforward idea of how to communicate with the public and delve deeper into the key aspects of effective communication and also identify the barriers that exist to communication. In this presentation, I'll provide a brief overview of the importance that the practitioner brings to the broader review of the ICRP system of protection. I'll discuss communication challenges and suggest some paths forward. In developing this presentation, the task group had much discussion on what we should say. We decided in the end to adopt the following approach to this presentation. Firstly, norm is present in many industries and areas of society and therefore affects many people. For most people, the topic of radiation is very sensitive and therefore we must be clear in our communications. However, the current system of protection that we have is complex and open to interpretation and therefore difficult to implement in practice, and that leads to many difficulties in communication. As mentioned yesterday, it's sometimes difficult to communicate amongst ourselves as professionals, and therefore it's quite difficult to communicate with the public. Our main message is that any development, improvement, or application of the system of protection needs to take into account what is happening on the ground. Let me say a few words on the role of the practitioner in the system of protection. As we all know, UNSCIA assesses the science, ICRP establishes the philosophy, IAEA establishes the standards, and the national regulators implement the standards into regulation. Importantly, each step sets the foundation and the framework for the next step. The practitioners, for example through ICRP, provide the experiences for application of the system. We close the loop by communicating and describing the experiences from the application of the system of protection. And our task group, the task group on norm in industry, is an example of the practitioner's voice. Let me say a few quick words about our task group, and there are a few members here today as well. The task group was formed by ICRP in 2019. Our group consists of 6 operators, 6 regulators, and 6 professionals representing different institutes. Each member is nominated by their respective radiation protection society. Our group includes recognised international norm experts, and we think the balance is right between operators, regulators, and institutional representatives. Each of us apply the system of protection every day in our working lives. We meet quarterly and are developing a handbook of good practices for norm, which we hope to release in 2024. I will also say that our regular contact has established an excellent network, support network and communications network. In developing the presentation, we also had much discussion on what we mean by the term public. It's clear that for norm, the term public can be applied to a much wider grouping, such as workers and some regulators. This is because, unlike the nuclear industry or medical uses of radiation, people are generally unaware of the hazards and therefore think the worst. We therefore think that the term public, for norm, is quite broad and should encompass a range of stakeholders. Our group also went back to the basics and considered why is it important to effectively communicate the radiological risks of norm. And the answer is very, very clear. And that is that the radiological risks of norm tend to always be outweighed by other risks. However, decisions are usually made based on perceptions and various inconsistent interpretations of the system of protection. As practitioners, we see that the implications of this include a waste of scarce radiation protection resources, and more importantly, radiation protection expertise applied to non-issues. We see unnecessary rules that constrain the growing and more important circular economy. We see radiation used in political ways, and we see an unoptimised regulatory system. We believe that effective communication needs to address these issues. In relation to norm, there are a number of barriers to effective communication, and there's a list here and I'll pull out 3. The first one is that we really have no clear definition of norm. We might say we do, but we don't. We have individual and institutional interpretation of the rules around norm. And we see that perception of radiological risk in relation to norm is reinforced by the complexity that surrounds it. And communicating this is very difficult. So, let me focus on a few areas that, as practitioners, we see require improvement to better enable and more effectively communicate to the public. Firstly, radiation risk messaging. This has already been mentioned this week. As a profession, we seem to be really good at making up new terms, and we have many of them. We have 10 microsieverts per year, 1 millisievert per year, 20 millisieverts per year, dose limits, dose constraints, reference levels, blah, blah, blah. In practice, the terms norm, nuclear, and radioactivity are used interchangeably. In some situations, this is actually formalised into legislation where norm facilities are classified as nuclear facilities. The danger level is also unclear. I remember talking to a customs worker at a port, and he swore black and blue to me that this particular material was radioactively dangerous when the surface dose rate was above 0.4 microsieverts per hour. While the reason for having these terms and concepts is technically sound, it's a communications nightmare. As practitioners, we ask for no more new terms, please, and improve clarity. A second improvement opportunity is the graded approach. As practitioners, we actually love the idea of a graded approach. However, it is complex, subjective, and difficult to apply uniformly. In practice, we generally see that the graded approach collapses to simple compliance requirements based on overly conservative factors. Basically, in practice, if you're above a becquerel per gram, then you're regulated. As mentioned, we are aiming to produce an easy-to-understand practical example document with guidance on the graded approach, and we ask that in any review that these examples and guidance be considered. The third area requiring consideration is norm and exposure situations. And again, this has been mentioned, nothing new. Getting this right is absolutely fundamental because it defines the way we manage materials. We all know that we manage exposure situations differently. Basically, existing exposure situations are managed by concentrations, and planned exposure situations are managed by doses or risk. And norm sits in the middle. While norm is meant to be an existing exposure situation, the regulatory and practical implementation of this is often confusing. And also, in many situations, there is incentive to ignore moving from an existing exposure situation to a planned exposure situation when the risk demands it. We think it would be useful to have some fundamental research in this area. And I could have a complete another talk on radon, but let's leave that separate at this stage. Let me finish with a quick case study. It's one of my favourite, and it's actually a true story, not made up. It shows the importance of thinking about radiation as one of a number of hazards in a workplace and the madness of not doing this. Now, I will say that this is not an Australian smelter. The case study involved a copper concentrate feed into a smelter, where the copper concentrate contained more than 1 becquerel per gram. As we know, when you put some metals into a high temperature situation, they volatilise and move into the air. And in this case, the tappers, the people removing the molten metal from the smelter, were exposed. The authority assessed the doses via air sampling over 1 week. The average dust in air concentrations were 20 milligrams per cubic metre, and when you did the maths, that worked out to about 5 millisieverts per year. The authority banned the use of the concentrate. Now, people have done dust sampling before. 20 milligrams is a lot. That's really, really dusty. And in fact, it's 40 times the level of the copper in air concentration levels. The issue is not radioactivity, the issue was no ventilation. And let me conclude by saying that effective communication with the public requires a logical, consistent and simple approach to radiation protection. Practitioners need the tools and messages that are consistent and can be communicated and understood. Whilst we agree that the ICRP system of protection is sound, there are opportunities to improve clarity, interpretation, consistency and application. Let me conclude as I started. Please listen to the practitioners. There are some uncut diamonds amongst us and some of the things we do. And on behalf of the task group, thank you for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Jim, for your very nice presentation on the difficulties encountered about communication on norm. Our next speaker now is Hiroko Yoshida. Hiroko is a research professor of Tohoku University in Japan. During her career, she has been supervising all matters associated with radiation control and radiation safety as a radiation protection expert. And after the Fukushima accident, she has been engaged with local residents on radiation and risk. And she served as a chair of ICRP task group on public understanding on radiation and risk. So today our presentation will be on engagement with the public on radiation and risk. Hiroko, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm Hiroko Yoshida from Tohoku University, Japan, and in my presentation, I would like to introduce the upper practical guidance for engagement with the public on radiation and risks. And as explained by Jim in the previous my presentation, so the key concepts are similar, but now I am talking about. It's okay?
I will tell you 2 minutes before.
Okay.
Yeah,
so,
okay.
yeah, this guidance encompasses the fields related to the communication and engagement with the public comprehensively. So, it's already explained what is ARPA. So ARPA is the international voice of the RP profession, and now currently is 53 associated societies in 68 countries. So RP professionals are required to engage with the public in various situations, such as in medicine and in radon-related issues, and also in radioactive waste management, and also in the field of non-ionizing radiation as well. And also the experiences from the past emergencies, including the Fukushima accident, and also post-accident highlight enhancing the public understanding and the communication as the one of very important challenges for radiation protection professionals. So the ARPA recognized the importance of engagement with the public and the communication among the ARPA associated societies. So in order to address the request from associated societies, ARPA established a task group on public understanding of radiation risk in 2013, and in 2020, ARPA released the practical guidance for engagement with the public on radiation risk. So I quickly introduce the gist of the guidance, and this is the table of contents of the guidance, and it consists of 9 chapters. And in chapter 1, it says why engage with the public. So public understanding, trust, and consent are central to ensuring effective and proportionate radiation protection without unduly limiting the safe use of radiation for the benefit of mankind. The objectives of the guidance is to enthuse all of us in our profession to become more active public advocates for RP, and also to provide information, experiences, and techniques to help us to become more effective and comfortable in the engagement with the public. The aims of the guidance is providing the how to engage and communicate with the public, and it's not to what to say. So the second chapter describes who are the public. As you mentioned, it's a diverse road. So actually, there are, the public is not a single entity, of course, and there are so many differing groups and types of people involved, such as children, school children, babies, infants, mothers, fathers, and families, and patients in medicine, and local residents, NGOs, high-rating homes, politicians, and of course, journalists as well, etc., etc. So we know that there is no one-size-fits-all answer, but a number of strategies, skills, and techniques can be utilized for successful interactions. And the guidance is underpinned by these three considerations. So the first one is about exposure. So when we talk about the exposure around a few millisievert per year, actually that is the most practical relevance exposure level, and it is considered that the exposure at this level is as such are dominated by natural background. And from the current knowledge about radiation, if there is risk, but it is very small and comparable to commonly accepted risks in society. And the second consideration is about the gaps in perception on radiation risks between the public and the professionals. So the whole basis of effective engagement with the public is to understand and recognize differing perception, concerns, fears, and aspirations, and to openly acknowledge them with empathy and to move the dialogue forward. And the third consideration is about benefits and risks. So we have to weigh all the elements that characterize an exposure situation, and we RP professionals should always seek as far as possible to develop engagement in a framework of benefits and risks. And in chapter 4, so some practical suggestions are described in this chapter, which should be taken into account in a proportionate way in developing the strategy and plan for a specific situation. For instance, we should define our objectives, and we should identify the audience, and also we should identify who is directly affected, and also who is indirectly affected. So, number 5, good practices in the communication. So, from experiences over many years and in many situations, we already know perceptions are not easily changed simply by just presenting a scientific fact and information. So there is a need and approach based on two-way dialogue, active listening, transparency, showing empathy, and ultimately developing trust and respect between the parties. So to be successful, it is very important. Something can only be understood via the heart. And in this chapter, case study is also introduced from the Fukushima dialogue from actually the Professor Neward. And he says, lose a scientist and become a human being. It means we need to become more human-oriented, not scientist-oriented when we engage with the public on radiation risks. And also, is it safe? Or am I safe? Or is my family safe? This is, the likely highly to be asked by the public. But we have to be very careful to answer this question because the question might vary dependent on the situations, of course, and also dependent on the relationship between you and the person who you are talking to. Because what seems safe to you may not be safe to others. And also use of different media is described in chapter 6. So we growing importance of social media as a key information channel. And it is important to see this as an opportunity for associative societies to become a meaningful communicator. But also, it should be noted at the same time, the social media can potentially become a tool for spreading misinformation and also manipulation and spreading anxiety. So in chapter 7, guidance for specific situation is described. So you will see useful and specific tips in each situation and support reference material here, such as in medicine, radon, and NIR, and waste management, and also emergencies and malevolent use of radioactive source, post-accident, and long-term recovery situation. So, ARPA further promotes enhancements and shared information that experiences at the full range of situation which we encounter. So, ARPA welcomes the proposal to actively promote an enhanced public engagement program. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Hiroko. To be a good communicator, we need to be a good human being. Yep. And the next speaker is Andrew Mayol from Environmental Agency, United Kingdom. He is a member of ICRP Committee 4 and also a member of Task Group 105 and Task Group 124. As his affiliation shows, he is practically involved in environmental protection issues. Today, he's going to talk about his experience and view with emphasis on sustainable development. The presentation title is Developing the System of Radiological Protection to Enhance its Contribution to Sustainable Development. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nobuhiko, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and I can say now that I won't be selling any books outside after this talk, but I might sign a few autographs if you want one. Actually, it's really good that this talk follows on from the brilliant talk from Bob McDonald this morning, because one of the things I'll be doing is considering our role as radiological protection and other professionals in this room in tackling some of the sort of global issues that we're all facing at the moment, including climate change. So it's in that context I'll be considering the keeping the ICRP recommendations fit for purpose. I really believe that radiological protection has a strategic enabling role in for example, energy, healthcare, the norm industries, as we heard, space travel, you name it. We have that enabling role while at the same time protecting people and the environment. So, since the last recommendations in 2007, we've experienced a profound change in the global situation. We're now facing the climate emergency, as we know, biodiversity emergency, various pollution crises. We've had a pandemic and various other health crises as well, including malnutrition and malaria. We have the cost of living crisis, war in Ukraine, the list goes on. So the context in which our system operates has changed profoundly over the last 15 years. And also the way that we communicate and use things like social media has changed a lot as well. So, this is all the context in which, our system has to operate. And the big question for me is, should all of this change, influence, or indeed change the way that our system is designed, communicated, the way we engage upon it, or indeed the way we apply it? I suggest that it should influence it. So, just coming back to the kind of primary purpose of our system, we've heard this said a few times already this week. It's written there on the slide, so I won't repeat it. But is that still fit for purpose? Is that primary aim still fit for purpose? It's the statement really that sort of sets the tone for the whole system and the whole practice of radiological protection. It's really good that the term without unduly limiting desirable human actions is in there. But is that positive enough? Is it aspirational enough? Is it active enough? Or is it a bit passive? You know, could it be changed? Could it be improved to sort of set a kind of a different sort of tone for our system going forward? And in any case, who decides what desirable human actions are? Question. So perhaps another way of thinking about this is through the lens of sustainable development. And as Werner alluded to yesterday, it's a useful framework for kind of assessing, you know, how we're developing and adding value as a system. Of course, sustainable development's not a new concept. It's been around for at least a few decades and probably around for millennia. Probably our predecessors are probably better at it than we are. So it's not a new concept. It's already referenced in a lot of ICRP documents. But my view is it's not central enough. It's not integral or fundamental enough in the system as a whole. It's often seen as a bit of an add-on, a bit of a nice thing to do on the side, you know. And I believe it should be more integral and centre stage in the system. It's probably interesting to kind of note as well that this morning we had a lot of good talks about ethical values, the values that are talked about and set out in ICRP 138. And those values that are set out have a lot of commonality with the underlying values for sustainable development, in particular associated with human rights and human dignity and all those kind of principles. So our system in ethical terms shares a lot with sustainable development. So that's a good thing. The Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them, as many of you will know, the UN goals. They're all relevant to some extent, but some are obviously much more relevant than others. And as has been highlighted previously, goal number 3 in relation to good health and well-being is a key one. But there are others. So let's drop down into the next level down, the RP principles. So how do our values and in particular sustainable development goals relate to the 3 principles of radiological protection? Some of this has been touched on this morning already, which is great. Justification, key value there, beneficence, and making sure that what we do does more good than harm. And that's certainly a place where we can bring into the reckoning sustainable development goals. They're a very useful framework for considering whether new practices and new interventions do actually create more good than harm. Optimization, a bit more complex in terms of how it relates to ethical values. ICRP 101B, I think did a very good job of setting out that kind of broadening of the optimization process, and that was back in 2006. But there's still a long way to go in terms of actually bringing that work to life, and the work of TG 114 is critical in that regard. But that document, ICRP 101, does refer to sustainability as one of the many factors to be taken into account. What about limitation then? We know that limits have probably done a good job of protecting us. But how do we know the limits are set correctly? You know, who have we asked? There's two fundamental aims of limits. You've got protect from tissue reactions, which is, I guess, relatively simple. But secondly, to reduce the probability of stochastic effects to a tolerable level. And as we heard this morning, this is a multi-attribute judgment which cuts across many ethical values, and it's not an easy judgment call. And you know, who have we asked about that judgment? Who makes that judgment? We run the risk of limits being too high, of course, and not protecting sufficiently. Conversely, we run the risk of them being too restrictive and perhaps hindering activity, which has a significant well-being and sustainable development benefit. So as a result of our system in that situation, you know, we're causing more harm than doing good if that situation occurred. So, but in principle, I think the principles themselves are sound. I think, but there's more we could do perhaps to improve the way that they are implemented, and indeed lots of work is, as you've heard, going into doing exactly that. I think there's 4 areas I've highlighted here where I think we can improve their application. We can integrate more and learn from other disciplines to make sure that we really do broaden out our considerations. And be, you know, perhaps less blinkered in the way we look at things. We need to properly value and account for the full range of costs and detriments and benefits over the appropriate temporal and spatial scales, and that's where this, for example, the intergenerational equity principle comes in. You know, are we really valuing and accounting for all the various factors effectively, and therefore influencing good sound decision making. And as been mentioned once or twice before already this week, including earlier in this session, we need to make sure we optimize overall protection. Optimization is many things, but one thing it is not is radiation dose minimization. It's one thing it is not. And we need to improve decision making through better collaboration, communication, and participation of citizens, which is now much more feasible now with social media and the internet and so on. So just to finish off then, what are the takeaways for me for this session really? Well, it's crucial that the system provides for an appropriate level of human and environmental protection overall, while enabling sustainable development and avoiding unintended consequences. And this now is more important than ever, given the crises that we face. And so I would therefore make a suggestion that perhaps to change the primary aim of the system, to make it more active and aspirational, to contribute to sustainable development while protecting humans and the environment from the harmful effects of radiation. And then there's a couple of other kind of key takeaway messages there from me. We do need to review the application of fundamental principles, and we are doing that already, of course. And as I alluded to earlier, greater account is needed of better informed, integrated, inclusive, and holistic risk management in society, because that will help society and citizens make better informed choices about energy and healthcare and all those other things that we enable in our work. Thanks for listening. You've been a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, for providing an insight into this challenging issue. Next is the last speaker. From a perspective of relation to the public, there is an important issue, waste management. And for this topic, we have Chantal Medley from Nuclear Waste Management Organization of Canada. She is going to talk about reframing the inadvertent human intrusion scenario to improve public understanding of repository safety. Chantal, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm a senior scientist at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and I'm very honored to be speaking to you today. So at the NWMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, a lot of our work hinges on translating a very technical story or a technical concept into a story that's digestible by the public. So my presentation title is a little wordy, but it's essentially about writing the proper storyline around a big what-if questions that test the safety of a radiological system to help improve the public understanding of safety. So in this case, the system is a deep geological repository for used nuclear fuel, and the big what-if question is, what if someone inadvertently drills into it? Figure out how to change this. There we go, I got it. First, a quick slide on the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So our job is to implement a safe, long-term plan to manage Canada's used nuclear fuel. We complete the life cycle of the used nuclear fuel in Canada. The NWMO is an independent, arm's-length, non-for-profit organization funded by the companies who generate Canada's used nuclear fuel. And it was mandated by federal legislation in 2002. So our first years started with a dialogue with the public, speaking to people across Canada about what was important to them when it came to managing Canada's used nuclear fuel. And after 3 years of dialogue, we put forward a proposed plan. That plan was called Adaptive Phased Management, and it combines an adaptive management approach and a technical solution, which is a deep geological repository. And we're currently in the siting process, and we hope to identify a single site by the end of 2024. So what is a deep geological repository? I acknowledge that many of you here probably do know what it is, but we have a diverse crowd of RP professionals, so I'll spend a slide discussing it. A deep geological repository uses a combination of engineered and natural barriers to safely contain and isolate the used fuel for the very long term. It's a network of underground placement rooms and tunnels that would be constructed at a depth of approximately 500 meters, depending on the rock characteristics at the site. Used nuclear fuel bundles would be placed within copper-coated steel containers, and these containers would be placed within bentonite buffer boxes, and these bentonite buffer boxes would be put in the placement rooms. These placement rooms would be backfilled with bentonite clay, and bentonite clay is a natural material that is a powerful barrier to water flow. After the placement rooms are filled with the used nuclear fuel, and after a period of extended monitoring, the shafts and tunnels would be sealed and closed. This figure shows a schematic of the DGR concept during operations because the surface facilities are still at site. But in the long term, it's expected that these facilities would be removed. So how do we test the ability of the repository to contain the hazard posed by the used nuclear fuel? We perform safety assessments, and this is what my team does at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization. So a safety assessment asks the what-if questions about the repository performance and estimates hypothetical effects to humans and the environment. So it doesn't predict the future, but it considers a range of scenarios with different likelihoods and consequences. Safety assessments that would be submitted as part of a license application would be subject to an independent CNSC review. So what type of scenarios do we look at in safety assessment? So the first type of scenario would be the scenario where all barriers perform as expected. In this scenario, there would be no human or environmental exposure. And the purpose of this scenario is to essentially to demonstrate the concept, demonstrate the safety of the repository concept. Secondly, we look at scenarios where repository barriers start to behave differently than expected. The barriers are the fuel, the cladding, the container, the seals, and the rock. So this is the start of the what-if questions. We start small. What if a container fails? And on top of that, what if the fuel dissolves quicker than we thought? Then we start to consider scenarios that are a little bit less likely, but that result in more significant results and consequences. What if all containers fail or multiple containers fail? And what if there's a fracture nearby that we didn't expect? Quantifying these questions into deterministic and probabilistic numerical analyses gives us a measure of a repository's safety and helps us to understand how the different barriers behave under different conditions. It helps us to bound the dose to hypothetical future human and non-human populations. However, if we continue to push the what-if questions into scenarios that remove some of the barriers and then eventually into scenarios where all the barriers are removed, the results of these scenarios no longer give us a measure of the repository's safety. So the human intrusion scenario, where the fuel is intercepted and brought to the surface, is one of these. The human intrusion scenario is discussed in our safety assessment, but it doesn't, as I said, provide a measure of repository safety. So in fact, the high dose consequences of the human intrusion scenario establishes the need for a deep geological repository. And this point, that the human intrusion scenario establishes the need for a deep geological repository, is at the center of how the human intrusion scenario needs to be framed for public messaging. The inadvertent human intrusion scenario assumes that sometime in the future, there will be a loss of institutional control and of repository records. It assumes that an exploratory drill crew drills into the geosphere, and if the drilling is in the vicinity of the repository, it could breach the shaft or the placement room. And this could create a preferential pathway for water to the surface. However, these scenarios are bound by the scenarios on barrier performance that I talked about on the last slide. But if the drilling breaches the container and brings the fuel core to the surface, all barriers have been bypassed. And depending on the exposure scenario that's modeled, this could lead to potentially high dose consequences. So, if the human intrusion scenario bypasses all barriers and doesn't provide a metric of repository safety, why then do we include it in our safety assessments? One straightforward reason is that the CNSC requires it. So for deep geological repositories in Reg Doc 2.1.1, where the site characteristics and the depth and the design of the facility have already been optimized to reduce the likelihood of the intrusion, the assessment of results of human intrusion scenarios should be used for illustrated purposes. The ICRP also recommends that the significance of human intrusion be evaluated, but identifies that because intrusion has bypassed all barriers, dose constraints should not be imposed. And there's also a natural curiosity to be satisfied by the public and by us alike. We're curious. So we included, and we should include it, but let's make sure the scenario is framed so that the public hears the right message. So the next two slides, I will show you two ways of framing the human intrusion scenario, giving potentially different public messages. So in the first scenario, or public message, the human intrusion scenario is coupled with safety assessment. The storyline could be as follows. Safety assessments are used to measure the performance of the repository. Safety assessments present a range of scenarios. Inadvertent human intrusion is one of these scenarios. Inadvertent human intrusions scenarios are very uncertain and difficult to parameterize, and the consequences can be high. However, the likelihood is low, and we were very conservative in our estimates, so don't worry, the repository is safe. What does the public hear from this? Forget understanding that the risk of human intrusion is small. Now they see it as possible, and they see that the consequences are bad. And therefore, they could see that the repository is an environmental problem. But let's decouple it from safety assessment. Storyline would go as follows. Interim storage is safe while institutional controls are in place. However, we cannot guarantee institutional controls indefinitely. And without institutional controls, the risk of human intrusion into interim storage increases. The results of the human intrusion scenarios show us that for used nuclear fuel, we need to minimize the risk of human intrusion into the waste to as little as possible. And the repository addresses the problem of human intrusion. It makes the risk of human intrusion as low as possible. The repository separates the used fuel from the surface environment. It puts it outside of the typical range of exploratory boreholes and away from natural resources. And therefore, the repository can safely contain and isolate the used nuclear fuel, as shown by our other safety assessment scenarios, while minimizing the risk of human intrusion. This way, the public correctly sees the repository as doing a job to protect the environment. It is not an environmental problem, it's an environmental solution. That's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm hoping that my talk has been helpful to you in your own work of communicating to the public, and I encourage questions during question period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting and very specific. And Well, we have about 20 minutes for question. Perhaps just to launch this discussion, because this session is on radiological protection and the public, I would like to have a common question on how to communicate in radiation protection with the public or the patient in an efficient way, how to engage a better dialogue with the public or the patient. So my question is for all of you, based on your experience in your specific sector, using perhaps the principle of a SWOT analysis, could you share with us in your sector one difficulty encountered to engage a dialogue on radiological protection with public, and also an opportunity to improve this dialogue? Yeah?
Oh no, that means I have to go first. So I'll start with what we can do to improve actually the way we communicate. And it's actually coming back to a point that was mentioned by Hiroko as well. It's about the listening and informing your communication based on actually what people want to know rather than what we think they want to know. We have a tendency of telling people what we think they need to know, when in reality, we miss the point of actually asking them what they actually want to know. In terms of what we do very well, I think actually, to be honest, we are getting better. I can't necessarily say we've done everything absolutely swimmingly amazingly, but what we're getting better at is actually building that trust with people early.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as for me, as a medical doctor, I think the most important thing is education. However, there are many people who have some prejudice on the radiation risk. So in that case, the sincere communication is not always available. So I think the most important thing is the trust on the expertise. We need to have patient trust. For that, I always think that say them that I'm free of conflict of interest. I'm just for you. And so the trust is important thing, I think.
I'm just going to say one word, and that's listening. I think the most important thing is to listen and understand what people are asking, rather than wanting to educate everyone. I think the more we understand what people are thinking, the more we're able to have a discussion and continue that discussion.
So based on my experiences after the Fukushima accident, so the most difficult issue in engagement with the public is the various perceptions of experts on health effects from the exposure less than 100 millisievert. So immediately after the accident, so the experts whose expertise are different, so they explained in their own perception. And some people say, it's totally safe until the exposure dose does not exceed 100 millisievert. And some people said the radiation dose exposure is very, very dangerous, and the radiation dose should be reduced as much as possible. And 10 millisievert or 50 millisievert is dangerous also. So, and some people say, it's a very, very low risk of causing the cancer, but you should reduce the exposure as much as possible. So, and what happened after that? So, it's a puzzle that confused the public. And finally, public came to think that we cannot trust the expert anymore. So I think the most important thing for radiation protection professionals is we should cooperate together. And when we say, the important thing to address the difficult issues, so I think the ICRP, ARPA, and IAEA, and of course in WHO, and other healthcare, and so we should say one message with the many voices. So I think that is a very important thing. Thank you.
Yeah, I think first of all, I would certainly endorse the listening principle. I think goes without saying. I think that's absolutely right. I think you know, and the recognition that there's a lot of expertise out there in the public at large, and a lot of expertise to tap into. So you know, think about it as a resource to use to enable better decisions. So listening a key point. I think. Other aspects for me is dialogue. You know, it's a two-way or even three-way conversation. You know, and we've taken the opportunity in the UK to use a government-backed dialogue facility called ScienceWise in the past, which is a facilitatory service to enable public dialogue about any kind of new technological risks, whether they be in relation to new medical treatments or new energy technologies, anything really that introduces potentially risk into society. There is a public dialogue facility in the UK to explore using members of the public selected from a sort of demographic sample across the public. And experts as well, of course, and professionals. So that's a really good dialogue facility that we've taken advantage of in the past in the Environment Agency. I think coming back to the difficulty, I think going back to my earlier point, treating the public as a vital resource to use wisely, and I think you know, it's using that public attention wisely and in a well-targeted way. Because otherwise, you know, in my experience, you can kind of sometimes overload the public with consultations and things like that. So using their attention wisely is a difficulty as well.
Yeah, two thoughts for me, I guess. One of the difficulties, at least we have in engagement, is making sure that you're communicating in a way that's understandable to the public, and so using plain language. We're technical people for the most part, and so we have to make sure that when we're talking to the public, we're not using our technical language to communicate. So I think that can be very helpful. And also from experience and engagement at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, really trust, and this has been mentioned before, is at the basis of this. And so it takes time to build relationships, and that's really what is at the core, I think, of a lot of it, is building relationships with people who then can trust you and understand what you're trying to exchange with them.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Thank you. And again, really interesting session. Thanks. It's Liz Ainsbury from UKHSA and Committee 1. I hate these things. So I have a question related to something that's been touched on a little bit this morning and also this afternoon, and it's kind of a follow-on to what was just asked. But there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the more diverse the communities that we engage with in terms of answering a question, the better what we come up with represents our diverse society. So my question is, communication is so important, but how do we start the conversation with those diverse communities who aren't necessarily interested, engaged, involved already in what we're trying to do here? Thank you.
I'll kick it off and hopefully others will jump in. It's a really interesting point, and you've got to think about what's the connection between you two. So whenever you start a conversation, if there's a common connection between people or a common goal or something that you share in common, that's how you get the conversation started. So a very simple example might be, if you want to talk about nuclear power, one of the easiest things you can say is, in some ways, I'm someone that lives on this planet, I care about climate change, I want to have a future for future generations, and that's why I want to talk to you about this. That forms a connection because it's something people actually all commonly can get behind. So I'd say, understand what that connection is to start the conversation.
I would say a little bit different. I would.
That's good.
I would just say it's as much about creating an environment where communication can occur, where it's safe for everyone. So, you know, all the public meetings that we have, people turn up on time and leave on time. The best thing to do is just hang around and just. So I think it's more the informal side of things in creating the environment rather than forcing it. it's just one part of a huge issue.
Yeah, just to add on to those points, I think one of the starting points for me is creating a diverse workforce in your own organisation, and we've had a big push on that in recent years, because that's one of the starting points, really, one of the building blocks for enabling that engagement with a more diverse community externally, is to start to build in that diversity internally first. So that's one aspect for me, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Fred DeMarker with Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. And I also very much appreciated the presentations. I'd like to direct this question, though, to Mr. Bryant and Mr. Mayall. You both touched on very similar concepts of an all-hazards approach, a holistic approach to risk management. I'd like to tease out a little bit, if you can, a practical approach to achieving this, recognizing that all risks are different. Mm-hmm. So how do we get to a place where we can compare all the hazards and come up with a balanced approach or a holistic approach to risk management? Mm-hmm. If you could just provide some practical approaches, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll start off by saying if it was that easy, we would have already solved it a long time ago. But you're right, there is a massive element to this, which is the practical application piece. And whatever you do as a tool or technique to deliver such an outcome, it has to be readily understandable and repeatable. So you must be able to have an audit trail to your decision-making process. So in some ways, elements of this are already being done, but it's being done differently in different countries and to a different degree. Mm-hmm. So if you look at it, for instance, I'll bring it back to, I'll apologize, I used to be a safety case manager, so I'll apologize now. But even from a safety case point of view, when you make a decision, you go through a decision-making process which should consider all the different risks and hazards within it. Not just the risks and hazards, it will consider things such as technical feasibility of the options you're picking. Some of that is quantitative, some of it is qualitative, because in reality, trying to do everything and come up with a framework where you could compare all risk on a level playing field, we could probably have academic researchers on it till the end of time. So you have to have something simple, usable. It might be elements of it are qualitative, but you can do it. There are evidence of it being used in some industries to different degrees. We don't necessarily cross-share those ideas as well as we could do between industries, between countries, but in general, what we need to accept is it needs to start with there's actually something in the standards set by people like ICRP, like the IEA, that says you need to consider all of those. Because if you actually consider those points, as simple as having it written down, it forces people to start actually doing it rather than salami slicing hazards. And I think we can probably all agree, and for those of us who worked in the nuclear industry, we'll have examples of where ALARA has worked really well, but a lot of opportunities where we necessarily haven't got the sustainable outcome out. Simple example being shielding. If you look at an example of shielding, you can keep reducing your exposures and use more and more steel, more and more concrete. What about the carbon footprint of that steel and concrete? What about the resources being used, the water being used, the amount of manpower going into designing it? Is that a sustainable outcome? So no simple solution, but we could start the journey by getting the wording right within the next system of protection.
Yeah, just to add to that, it's not easy, and it's an evolving kind of practice in a way, and we're always looking to kind of use the best available approaches to these questions. In terms of some of the practicalities, though, just to answer your question, one of the things we require as a regulator, and Pete's already referred to it, is on the environment side, is environment cases, so where that kind of holistic and integrated view of a proposal is taken into account, and in that, we expect a whole range of aspects and impacts to be taken into account. In terms of assessing and valuing those, or carrying out some evaluation on those kind of impacts, we have a range of practical tools and guidance in the UK. For example, we have guidance on Treasury guidance on economic appraisal evaluations, all that kind of stuff. Guidance on multi-attribute decision analysis. There's a variety of tools that you can use to come to those evaluations of the whole range of impacts to try and get the best outcome. But it is challenging, and those assessments have to be proportionate to the size of the issue at stake. So, you know, if it's a very, very big project, then we would expect, you know, quite a comprehensive assessment. If it's a small project, then obviously less so. But yeah, I hope that answers your question to some extent. Thank you.
So so I think it is very difficult to answer your question because there is no, one simple answer to your question. So that's why, you know, when we they create the ARPA guidance. So we just say how to they engage with the public, and we should we didn't describe what to say in our guidance because the situation is very complicated, and the situation varies depending on events. So we have to understand the basic principles, and also in a holistic way we have to combine and integrate the idea how to do that, and then we can see what we should do and what we should say to the public. So,
Thierry?
Yeah, briefly, I would like to make the link with the discussion we had this morning on the ethical session, notably with regard to accountability, because in fact, to start the dialogue is very difficult. You have demonstrated that. But then, as soon as you have the dialogue, one of the key points is in which way this dialogue is also incorporated into the decision, and there is a feedback with the stakeholder. So I don't know if you have some good example or some lesson learned from a bad example to improve the way we not only discuss with the public, but involve them into the decision-making process, and we have some accountability for the sustainability of the decision.
Very good question.
If I understood the question correctly, one example is we had a regulatory decision to make in terms of a particular radioactive discharge, and we came to a position on that. I won't name any names in terms of sites, but and we consulted on a proposed decision, and we had lots of feedback, including international representations, and we took into account all of that feedback, and we ended up modifying our proposed decision to require some additional measures to be taken. So I mean, I know that's a very generic answer, but we have examples of where we have taken into account representations from the wider public. But I think going back to the earlier question from Bernard about difficulties, one of the difficulties is managing expectations as well, because one of the issues about, or one of the problems with engaging with the public is it's not a referendum, it's often not a voting exercise. So you kind of have to manage expectations in terms of what can be achieved in terms of engaging with and having that dialogue, and not sort of raise expectations too high, I guess. But that is a difficulty, and it's an ongoing challenge.
Yes, Peter?
So I'll just add to that. It's not always as simple as thinking, what do we think the risk is or what the hazard is? So for a prime example, on the new nuclear build side, we've had cases where we think we understand what the public are interested in, what they're going to be concerned about. However, that's not always true. And I'll give you a very simple example, and some of you will have heard about it before, which was as simple as an activity of dredging sediment. So that's where you basically take sediment from around the site where we're building a power station, you move it and you put it somewhere else. And that's very, very standard activity used in construction. But because of the location of that sediment being right next to an operating power station and a decommissioning power station, the public instantly assumed that was going to be radioactive material in the sea. So we were going to dump radioactive waste into the sea. Now, the actual, if you measure what's in that sediment, it was predominantly naturally occurring, which probably doesn't surprise most people. It's about 90% naturally occurring radioactivity and about 10% from various man-made sources, not just nuclear power. Now, the exposures were trivial, about 20 bananas worth, I made the mistake of once saying. And those 20 bananas worth of exposure, though, to the public was of real concern. Because they thought it was radioactive waste, it attracted a lot of attention from some of the anti-nuclear groups. It caused actual real public concern and societal stress. So what was a very simple activity ended up reaching about 150,000 people wrote into a petition. It reached media coverage abroad. You had people who were members of the public genuinely concerned writing in. And that was an example where we didn't think there was any risk. We didn't think of what the public's view would be because it's such a standard activity. But we didn't get it right because there was a societal impact. And so that's an example of where we can learn, and we do need to start informing decisions based on actually asking the public. It comes back to the earlier point, talk to the public, build up those relationships early.
So may I say some comment?
Yeah, okay? Very quickly because...
Yeah, so with regard to the dialogues, I think the dialogue is very important and it's very useful. And but only the limited number can attend the dialogue. And in order to know the each situation of each person, so the dialogue works very well. But we have to take the different types of approach to the public. So, for example, after the Fukushima accident, Japanese government and the local government, they started to have a big conference, and they are, they collected many people, public, and the famous professor, gave a talk. But soon, the public, the people said, oh, they didn't listen to our story. They couldn't. So we changed. So we are, combined the different approaches. So the dialogue is useful, and also the conference is useful, and also, as I said, the message from the experts is also, important. That's it. Thank you.
So, officially. It is the end of the session, but for a good dialogue, I don't want to create frustration, and we have 2 questions, so please, but very quickly, if we try to answer to your question, I will be very pleased.
I'll be quick. Just following up a bit on what Fred was saying and some of the other speakers, with balance, especially between chemical and radiological risk. As a risk assessor myself, it impacts communication, it impacts perspective at a very fundamental science level. And even when we go to discuss it, we've been bringing in chemical hazards a little bit into some of the presentations. I heard about some metal contamination the total suspended particulates in your presentation, and but we're focusing on the RADs. And then if you go to CTAC or some of these other conferences, they're very focusing on the non-RADs. But the Impact Assessment Act is focusing more on cumulative effects, an all-hazards approach, but yet we're talking about it in different forms. And as well, if for ICRP, yes, the focus is RAD, but maybe there's a need for a task group to look at cumulative effects, where we are looking at things holistically. We're bringing in people from outside the nuclear industry to look at that all-hazards approach. So that we start looking at forums for discussion when we're doing it together, we start to look at publications when we're doing it together, and then maybe we can start finding that balance.
Okay, so thank you. It was in fact a comment and not a question. Yeah. Thank you so much for perhaps the last question, but really the last.
Okay, Yoshi Shimada from Japan, and I understand the importance of transparency, accountability, and trust, but I'm a little bit skeptical about the trust, How can we be trusted? you know, sometimes my wife and my colleague in institute are skeptical to me. and anyhow, especially, I wanted to ask all of them, in the case of emergency, maybe the communication skill may be different from the ideas today we learned. So in case of emergency, how can we make a trust? How can, you know, communicate with the people whom we do not know? We have never had a dialogue. So if you have some comment or idea, let me know.
So, communication under stress. Would you like to react, or you have an idea? Or?
I'll just say that the Society for Radiological Protection produced guidance on that, actually, specifically on communicating in an emergency. And what we tried to do was actually bring together non-radiological people into a room. The whole idea of bringing back in comms experts. So when we put this documentation together, it included ambulance services, it included the local authorities, it included members of journalists and other media specialists, and we all got in a room to talk about how to communicate radiation risk in an emergency. And it's a very short piece of guidance. The one thing that we learned from that was, if you want to communicate effectively, don't produce a 200-page document on how to communicate effectively. Produce a 10-page document on how you communicate effectively with very simple guidance. So we do have a guidance document out there that's freely available on the SRP's website. Rather than go through every point, I'll just say it's worth having a look.
Okay. So we need to be trusted by journalists or mass communications, you know, in emergency.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. To conclude.
Yep. Thank you very much for the active dialogue and discussion. And regarding the trust, I remember the word from Michael Boyd. He's there. In one workshop, he concluded that to be trusted, good communication is necessary. But to communicate well, trust is necessary. So it is just circular relationship. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for this very fruitful session. And please join me to applaud to all the distinguished speakers. Yeah. Thank you.